What if I told you that the monsters lurking in your favorite horror films aren't just products of twisted imagination? What if the truth behind these cinematic nightmares is somehow even more terrifying than the fiction itself? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're counting down the real serial killers who inspired the most iconic horror movie villains of all time. These aren't just loose inspirations or urban legends. These are documented cases where filmmakers took the darkest chapters of criminal history and transformed them into the characters that have haunted our screens for decades. We're ranking these entries based on three key factors: the cultural impact of the horror film they inspired, the strength of that inspiration, and the notorious legacy of the real killer behind it all. And trust me, when you find out who inspired our number one entry, you're going to look at that movie in a completely different light. Let's begin our descent into the twisted connection between true crime and horror cinema. Number 10. Andrei Chikatilo. Our countdown starts in Soviet Russia with one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, murdered at least 52 victims between 1978 and 1990. He specifically targeted women and children near railway stations, exploiting the chaos of Soviet-era travel to avoid detection for over a decade. Chikatilo's crimes directly inspired the character of Karl Rudnick Zeman in the 1995 thriller Citizen 10, starring Stephen Rea and Donald Sutherland. While technically more of a crime drama than pure horror, the film's unflinching portrayal of the investigation captures the methodical terror of hunting a predator in a system that initially denied serial killers could even exist in the Soviet Union. The movie stays remarkably close to reality, depicting the bureaucratic nightmares investigators faced and the chilling interviews with Chikatilo himself. What makes this connection particularly haunting is how the film reveals that systemic dysfunction and denial can be just as terrifying as the killer himself. Chikatilo ranks at number 10 because while Citizen X is critically acclaimed, it doesn't have the same mainstream horror recognition as other entries on this list. Still, it serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters operate in plain sight, protected by the very institutions meant to stop them. Number 9. Richard Chase. In the late 1970s, Sacramento, California was terrorized by a killer so disturbing that even hardened homicide detectives struggled to comprehend his actions. Richard Chase, dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento, committed a series of murders driven by paranoid delusions. He believed he needed to consume blood to prevent his own blood from turning to powder. Chase's crimes influenced the characterization of James Dark, also known as Johnny Barlow, in the horror film Shocker from 1989. Though more directly, elements of his pathology appeared in various vampire horror films of the 80s that moved away from romantic gothic vampires toward more realistic, psychotic interpretations of bloodlust. The key difference between Chase and fictional vampires: Chase wasn't supernatural. He was a deeply mentally ill individual whose delusions drove him to unspeakable acts. No mysticism, no immortality, just the horrifying reality of untreated schizophrenia manifesting as violence. Chase lands at number 9 because while his influence on horror exists, it's more diffuse and thematic rather than inspiring one definitive, iconic character. His case did, however, fundamentally change how horror writers approached the concept of vampirism in modern settings, grounding supernatural themes in psychological horror. Number 8. Richard Ramirez. The mid-80s brought terror to California in the form of the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez broke into homes under cover of darkness, leaving a trail of violence across Los Angeles and San Francisco. What made Ramirez particularly frightening was his randomness. He had no specific victim profile, no predictable pattern, making everyone feel vulnerable. Ramirez's crimes and persona influenced several horror antagonists, most notably contributing to the characterization of the Night Stalker in the 2018 film of the same name, as well as elements of various home invasion horror films throughout the late 80s and 90s. His courtroom behavior, flashing satanic symbols, and showing zero remorse added a theatrical element that horror filmmakers found compelling. The fictional portrayals often emphasized the randomness and the violation of the home as a safe space, which was the core of Ramirez's real terror. Unlike movie monsters that follow rules or have specific motivations, Ramirez represented pure, chaotic evil, making him impossible to predict or avoid. He ranks at number 8 because while his influence on horror is undeniable, particularly in home invasion subgenres, he didn't inspire a single iconic character that became a household name. His legacy in cinema is more about atmosphere and theme than a specific monster we can point to. Number 7. Jeffrey Dahmer. Between 1978 and 1991, Milwaukee became the hunting ground for one of America's most notorious killers. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, but it was what he did after the murders that truly shocked the world. His crimes involved dismemberment, necrophilia, and even attempts at creating living zombies through crude lobotomies. Dahmer's case inspired elements of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, though we'll talk more about that film's primary inspiration later. More directly, the 2002 film Dahmer, starring Jeremy Renner, attempted to portray his psychology, and elements of his methodology appeared in various horror films, dealing with themes of obsession and possession. What separates Dahmer from fictional monsters is the profound loneliness and desperation in his psychology. He didn't kill out of rage or sadism in the traditional sense. He killed because he couldn't bear for his victims to leave. The horror isn't just in the acts themselves, but in the pathetic, broken humanity behind them. Dahmer ranks at number 7 because while his notoriety is massive, and his influence on crime horror is significant, the characters he inspired aren't as immediately recognizable as the icons higher on our list. His impact is more about bringing psychological depth to horror antagonists than creating a specific, memorable monster. Number 6. Aileen Wuornos. The term serial killer typically conjures images of male predators, which is why Aileen Wuornos shocked America when her story broke in the early 90s. A highway prostitute turned killer, Wuornos murdered 7 men between 1989 and 1990, claiming they had assaulted or attempted to assault her during paid encounters. Wuornos most famously inspired the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron in an Oscar-winning performance. While Monster is more biographical drama than horror, Wuornos also influenced the portrayal of female killers in horror cinema, contributing to a shift away from the damsel in distress toward more complex, dangerous female antagonists. The key distinction between Wuornos and her fictional counterparts is context. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a victim who fought back in the only way she knew how? The reality is likely somewhere in between, making her story more tragic than terrifying, though no less disturbing. She lands at number 6 because while Monster is a powerful film, and Wuornos broke the mold for how we think about female killers, her direct influence on iconic horror cinema is more limited compared to the male killers who inspired the genre's most recognizable monsters. Number 5. Albert Fish. We're entering the top 5 now, and the cases get significantly darker. Albert Fish, active primarily in the 1920s, was a true nightmare made flesh, a seemingly ordinary house painter and father of 6. Fish confessed to murdering at least 5 children, though he claimed the number was closer to 100. His crimes involved unspeakable acts that we won't detail here. Fish's influence on horror cinema is substantial, though often unacknowledged. Elements of his character and methodology appear in various films, dealing with seemingly ordinary people harboring monstrous secrets. But most directly, he influenced the portrayal of the child killer in the remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street and similar characters, who hide behind masks of normalcy. What makes Fish particularly terrifying in comparison to fictional monsters is his complete ordinariness. He looked like everyone's grandfather. He wrote polite letters. He walked among society completely undetected for decades. Freddy Krueger has burned skin and knife fingers. Albert Fish had a kind smile. Fish ranks at number 5 because while his influence on horror is significant, particularly in how filmmakers portray hidden monsters, he didn't inspire a single character that became a cultural phenomenon. His legacy is more about demonstrating that evil doesn't announce itself. It often looks disappointingly human. Number 4. John Wayne Gacy. In the late 70s, the suburbs of Chicago learned that monsters don't just hide under beds. Sometimes they dress up as clowns at children's parties. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978, burying most of them in the crawlspace beneath his house. Gacy's terrifying clown persona fundamentally changed how popular culture viewed clowns, influencing everything from Stephen King's It to countless other killer clown narratives, while Pennywise, the dancing clown, predates Gacy in King's imagination. Gacy's real crimes cemented the killer clown archetype in the public consciousness and influenced how adaptations portrayed such characters. The difference between Gacy and Pennywise is that Pennywise is an ancient cosmic entity that occasionally takes clown form. Gacy was just a man who understood that the clown costume gave him access and trust. There's no magic, no shape-shifting, just psychological manipulation and a friendly disguise. Gacy lands at number 4 because while he fundamentally altered a cultural symbol and influenced horror significantly, he inspired a trope rather than a single iconic character. His impact is enormous but diffused across multiple films rather than concentrated in one legendary monster. Number 3. Jack the Ripper. We're jumping back over a century now to the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London. In the autumn of 1888, at least 5 women were murdered in the Whitechapel district in a series of killings so brutal they shocked an empire. The killer was never caught, and their identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Jack the Ripper has inspired countless horror films, from Hell to various adaptations and reimaginings. The mystery, the Victorian Gothic atmosphere, the gruesome precision of the crimes, all of it created the template for the sophisticated, intelligent killer that horror films have explored ever since. Elements of the Ripper appear in everything from Hannibal Lecter to Ghostface. Here's the chilling difference. Jack the Ripper was real, yet we know less about the actual person than we do about any fictional killer. The Ripper is the rare case where reality offers less information than fiction, creating an eternal mystery that filmmakers can endlessly reinterpret. Jack the Ripper ranks at number 3 because while the cultural impact is absolutely massive and the influence on horror is undeniable, the historical distance and the diffusion of that influence across countless films prevents it from claiming a higher spot. The Ripper inspired a genre more than a single iconic monster. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The 1970s introduced America to a new kind of killer. Charming, educated, attractive, Ted Bundy shattered the stereotype of what a serial killer looked like. He confessed to 30 murders of young women across 7 states, though the actual number is likely higher. He was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly without conscience. Bundy's influence on horror cinema is profound. He's been portrayed directly in several films, but more importantly, he influenced the characterization of Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, elements of various thriller antagonists, and helped establish the template for the charismatic psychopath in horror. The monster who could be your coworker, your neighbor, your date. The terrifying truth about Bundy versus his fictional counterparts is that Bundy actually existed, actually used his charm to lure victims, actually escaped from custody twice. Patrick Bateman lives in satire and ambiguity. Ted Bundy was horrifyingly, undeniably real. Bundy earns the number 2 spot because he fundamentally changed how we think about killers in both true crime and fiction. He proved that monsters don't need to look monstrous, and that revelation has influenced decades of horror storytelling. But there's one case that inspired an even more iconic horror character. Number 1. Ed Gein. We've arrived at number 1, and if you know your horror history, you probably saw this coming. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, was arrested in 1957 after police discovered human remains in his Wisconsin farmhouse. Gein had exhumed corpses from graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. He also murdered at least 2 women. Ed Gein inspired not 1, not 2, but 3 of horror cinema's most iconic characters. Norman Bates in Psycho Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Think about that for a moment. One real person influenced 3 separate films that defined horror across 3 different decades. The difference between Ed Gein and these fictional interpretations is scale and context. Norman Bates runs a quiet motel, Leatherface has a cannibalistic family. Buffalo Bill is creating a woman suit. Ed Gein was a lonely, deeply disturbed man living in isolation, his crimes driven by an obsession with his deceased mother and a confused sense of identity. Gein claims the number 1 position not just because of the sheer number of iconic characters he inspired, but because his case fundamentally shaped modern horror cinema. Before Gein, movie monsters were largely fantastical, vampires and werewolves, and creatures from lagoons. After Gein, horror filmmakers realized the most frightening monsters were human, could live next door, could seem almost pitiable in their broken psychology. The farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, wasn't a Gothic castle or a haunted mansion, it was just a house. Ed Gein wasn't a supernatural entity, he was just a man. And somehow, that's so much worse. So there you have it. The real killers who inspired the monsters that have haunted our nightmares for decades. From the Butcher of Rostov to the Butcher of Plainfield, these cases remind us of an uncomfortable truth. The scariest stories are the ones rooted in reality. The next time you watch Psycho or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Silence of the Lambs, remember that somewhere in those films are echoes of real victims, real investigations, real evil. Horror films let us explore darkness from a safe distance, but these cases remind us that darkness isn't always fictional. Here's a question to leave you with. Why are we so fascinated by these stories? What is it about the intersection of real horror and fictional horror that captivates us so completely? Thanks for watching. If this video kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying words in the English language aren't once upon a time. They're based on a true story.